The rise of Professor Jiang is not the story of a man becoming famous. It is the story of a system losing control over interpretation, and millions of people searching for something that finally makes sense of a world that feels increasingly chaotic, contradictory, and manipulated. For years, global narratives were shaped from the top down. Governments spoke, media translated, institutions validated, and the public consumed. That model depended on trust. It depended on the assumption that what was being presented was at least partially aligned with reality. But something broke. Over the past decade, trust began to erode. Wars were justified and later questioned. Economic systems promised stability but delivered inequality. Narratives shifted too quickly, too conveniently. And in that vacuum, figures like Professor Jiang did not just emerge. They were pulled into relevance by demand. He did not force his way into global attention. The world created the conditions for him to rise. What makes his trajectory different from traditional analysts is not just his content, but the structure of his thinking. He does not explain events as isolated incidents. He frames them as patterns, as cycles, as consequences of deeper forces that operate beneath the visible layer of politics. That approach resonates because it gives people a sense that they are not just watching chaos, they are witnessing something that can be understood if viewed from the right angle. And that is where his influence begins. He does not present himself as a typical academic. He does not rely on institutional authority to validate his voice. Instead, he builds credibility through perceived accuracy, through the feeling that what he says aligns with what people are already starting to suspect. One of the key moments that accelerated his rise was his prediction regarding Donald Trump. At a time when mainstream narratives were dismissing the possibility, he stated clearly that Trump would return to power. Not as a guess, not as a vague possibility, but as an outcome tied to structural forces within the United States. He argued that the system itself required disruption, that the contradictions within American society had reached a point where a figure like Trump was not just likely, but inevitable. When that prediction materialized, it did not just boost his credibility, it altered the perception of his entire framework. People began to look back at his previous analyses and forward to his future ones with a different level of attention. Because once someone appears to see what others miss, the audience shifts from casual listening to active anticipation. But it did not stop there. His analysis extended into the geopolitical sphere, particularly the escalating tensions between the United States and Iran. While many commentators framed the situation in terms of diplomacy, deterrence, or strategic ambiguity, Jiang described it as part of a broader pattern of imperial overreach. He suggested that the United States, as a global power, was entering a phase where it could no longer maintain the balance between its military reach, economic stability, and internal cohesion. In that framework, a confrontation with Iran was not an isolated decision, but a symptom of a system under pressure. He went further. He stated that the United States would attack Iran, and that such a conflict would not result in a clear victory, but would instead expose the limits of American power. This was not a popular view within mainstream discourse. It challenged the assumption of military superiority, the narrative of controlled intervention, and the belief that outcomes could be managed through force alone. Yet, as events began to unfold, as tensions escalated and conflict scenarios became more tangible, his analysis gained traction. Not because it was comforting, but because it offered a coherent explanation for why things were happening the way they were. And this is the core of his rise. He is not telling people what they want to hear. He is telling them something that feels like it fits the pattern they are already observing. That alignment between observation and explanation creates a powerful feedback loop. The more events appear to validate his framework, the more people trust the framework. And the more they trust the framework, the more they apply it to new events. This is how influence scales. It is not built on one viral moment. It is built on a series of perceived confirmations that reinforce a mental model. Another critical element is his communication style. He does not overload the audience with technical jargon. He translates complex systems into accessible narratives without losing depth. He connects historical cycles to modern events, showing how patterns repeat not in identical form, but in structural similarity. This allows viewers to see continuity where they previously saw randomness. And once randomness is replaced with pattern, fear is replaced with a sense of understanding. That psychological shift is significant, because people are not just consuming information, they are reorganizing their perception of reality. This is why his content spreads. It is not just informative, it is transformative. It changes how people think, not just what they think. And that is where the perception of danger begins to emerge from the perspective of established power structures. Because control over narrative is one of the primary tools of governance. If you can shape how people interpret events, you can influence how they respond to them. But when a figure like Jiang introduces an alternative interpretive framework that gains mass adoption, that control begins to weaken. People start questioning not just specific decisions, but the entire architecture of explanation. They begin to see media not as a neutral source, but as a participant in narrative construction. They begin to view policy not as isolated action, but as part of a broader strategic pattern. And once that shift happens at scale, the relationship between authority and audience changes fundamentally. Authority is no longer assumed. It must be continuously justified. That is a difficult position for any system to maintain. This is why some describe him as dangerous, not because he commands armies or controls resources, but because he influences perception. And perception, in the modern world, is power. It determines what people believe, how they act, and what they accept as legitimate. When millions of people begin to adopt a framework that challenges official narratives, the balance shifts. It does not collapse immediately, but it becomes unstable. And instability forces response. That response can take many forms. It can be direct, through criticism and attempts to discredit. It can be indirect, through algorithmic changes that reduce visibility. It can be subtle, through framing that positions him as unreliable or extreme. These are not unusual reactions. They are standard mechanisms used to manage disruptive voices. But there is a critical difference in this case. The speed and scale of his rise may have already passed the point where traditional containment strategies are fully effective, because his ideas are no longer confined to his own platform. They are being discussed, debated, adapted, and redistributed across networks. The audience is not just consuming his content. They are internalizing and replicating the framework. And once a framework becomes decentralized, it becomes much harder to suppress. You are no longer dealing with a single source. You are dealing with a distributed system of interpretation. This is where the idea that it might be too late begins to make sense, not in a dramatic or conspiratorial way, but in a structural one. The conditions that allowed him to rise are still present. The demand for alternative explanations is still growing. The trust in traditional narratives is still declining. As long as those conditions persist, figures like Jiang will continue to gain traction, whether it is him or someone else. He is not the cause. He is a manifestation. And that is perhaps the most important insight, because it shifts the focus from the individual to the environment. If you remove him, the underlying demand does not disappear. It looks for another outlet, another voice, another framework. That is how systems evolve. Not through single points of failure, but through continuous adaptation. In that sense, his rise is less about him personally and more about what the world is becoming. A world where information is abundant, but trust is scarce. Where narratives compete openly rather than being filtered quietly. Where individuals can build influence without institutional backing. And where the ability to connect patterns across domains becomes more valuable than specialization within a single field. This is the environment that produced Professor Jiang, and this is the environment that sustains his growth. The question is not whether he will continue to gain attention. The question is what happens next. Because influence, once established, must either evolve or be challenged. If his predictions continue to align with unfolding events, his credibility will strengthen further. If they diverge, his audience will reassess. That is the natural cycle of any predictive framework. But regardless of the outcome, the impact of his rise is already visible. He has contributed to a shift in how people engage with global events. He has encouraged a move from passive consumption to active interpretation. He has introduced a model that prioritizes pattern recognition over surface analysis, and he has done so at a scale that cannot be ignored. That is why his name is now circulating in discussions that extend far beyond his original audience. Not because everyone agrees with him, but because enough people are paying attention to change the conversation. And in a world where attention shapes reality, that is a form of power that carries consequences. Whether those consequences lead to greater clarity or greater confusion depends not just on him, but on how his audience uses the framework he provides. Because ultimately, the responsibility does not end with the speaker. It extends to the listener, to the one who interprets, who questions, who decides what to accept and what to reject. That is where the real transformation happens. Not in the content itself, but in the minds that engage with it. And that is why the rise of Professor Jiang is not just a story about one individual. It is a story about a shift in collective perception. A shift that is still unfolding, still being tested, and still shaping the way the world understands itself.